And we don't have, do we have a slide that says who's up here? We don't. We don't
Look at
don't
your phone.
have anything.
Everyone can look at their phone and scroll to the very bottom, 4 o'clock.
Yeah, so I'm John Sumser. I run the HRExaminer. Thanks for coming, and we're going to do some introductions that's going to include everybody in the room. We'll start with Alina. Would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, John. Hello, everyone. I'm Alina von Davier, and I lead ACTNext, which is the Business Innovation and Research and Development Unit at ACT. And my background is in mathematics and building mathematical models for learning, for assessment, for classification, and for prediction. I think that's for now sufficient.
That's great. I'm Josh Jarrett. I am the co-founder and chief product officer of a company called Koru, K-O-R-U. We're a Seattle-based predictive hiring company. So I have a 1,000th of the mathematical training of Alina. But I try and connect the dots really down to the users and how people use data to make better decisions.
So one of the things that's interesting about these two is this conference has been traditionally an ed tech conference over the years, and there's a lot of warmth and inclusion over the ed tech side, and this is part of a stretch out into the human capital marketplace. These two represent where that Venn diagram overlaps. It's a pretty interesting thing. So we've got an academic view of what assessment is and a commercial view of what assessment is, and that's what we're going to mine over the course of the conversation. For starters, would you mind, because we've got time, tell me your name and what company you represent or how you got here, because the audience is small and we may as well know who we're talking to. So let me start with you. Would you tell me your name and who you work for? Thank you.
Susan Donovan, I'm in Che, and I'm working on helping students with outcomes.
Great.
Oliver Stalin, I run a company called Mello, which does predictive hiring analytics related to culture. We do a lot of post-hire stuff on engagement, culture analytics within organizations.
Fantastic. Yeah.
My name is Amelia. I'm from the Learning Science Division of Talent.
Thank you, Ben. Fantastic.
I'm Claire. I'm the founder of SquarePeg. So we do predictive assessments, but we do them for job seekers and employers before the search.
Got it.
I'm Sarah Miguel. I'm the co-founder of Stellar Employ, and we do evidence-based predictive analytic learning for jobs.
Thank you.
It's Steidel. I work at Microsoft in the Worldwide Learning Company.
Thank you. Can you pull that door shut? Oh, he just left and didn't pull the door shut. Community-minded fellow.
Hi, I'm Kendall Bailey. I work at the College Board running innovation and data placement program.
Cool.
Hi, I'm Ashna. I'm the founder of Point Shortlist that does competency-based training and also assessments in emerging markets in India and East Africa.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kristen Ryan. I am a client executive with BetterUp. We have a scalable, personalized executive coaching for the non-executive solution, which is the platform and giving us the ability to offer organizations the opportunity to distribute coaching throughout their entire company.
Fantastic. This is awesome. So there are a lot of people in startups in the room. If you wouldn't mind giving me your card at the end of this, we're doing the annual look at who is who in AI and HR tech and recruiting, and I could use your contact information so that we could bury you in survey questions. So Alina, what does your company do? What do you do?
So ACT is known for its college admission test primarily. but ACT does more than that. And some of you may have heard the announcement we made today. ACT and ASU are partnering. So that was the announcement at 1 o'clock when I left you guys.
What does partnering mean?
So we plan to collaborate on research projects and new products. So we will work together as an extended group. We want to put together a center, and we will work bringing in students, postdocs, coming up with new research projects, and as I said before, products, hopefully. It has not yet been all outlined. It's going to be some work to do to figure that out. But this is just an example about how ACT as a company is changing. So ACT has been around for about 59 years. It started as as a disruptor, pretty much. Lindquist, who was a professor at University of Iowa, invented the automatic reader of for multiple choice test. And with that, he pretty much disrupted the way the assessment took place. He also proposed that the test for admission at university should be based on what students learn, so that the students can actually do something with the information they receive from the test. Not only a score, so they can know what to improve on, as opposed to other tests that were more aimed as aptitude and called aptitude at that time. Meanwhile, the SAT itself transitioned quite a lot and is also more curriculum oriented. But at that time, it was not, and for many years, there was this difference between the ACT test that was more curriculum oriented and SAT that was more aptitude oriented. So over the years, the company became quite successful to the point of becoming the lead in the country of admission college tests. So about 60% or more of the market is of ACT. Now we got a new CEO about 2 years ago, and he is changing the direction of the company and is moving it into learning and into becoming an ed tech company. And that's, of course, a strong claim to make, and, but he definitely talks the talk and walks the walk, pretty much. One of the things he did, among other things, of course, but since it's about me now, he hired me 18 months ago to lead this innovation group, and I put together a team in this 18 months. And at this conference, as well as at last week's conference in New York City at ARA and NCME, we had our first presentations based on the work and results that we actually conducted in the group. The approach that we take for learning is to base everything on our strengths. So what we know to do best is measurement and assessment. So for us, the question is, how can we differentiate ourselves from all these masses, as you can see here, of people who act in this learning environment? What do we bring to the table? So our learning components are within the evidence-centered design framework, which is quite familiar for those who have been working in assessment for years. So that's pretty much what we do. We worked, I have a team on artificial intelligence and one in advanced psychometrics and another one on learning solutions. And together we try to build these systems, and we do foundational research in developing models for how people learn, how people forget, how people deal with scaffolding and with hints. Then we have an artificial intelligence team that is working on tagging content, instructional content, as well as assessment content. And the learning solution person is driving the how and the what and the why.
So is your work still focused on the sort of academic environment, or do you see it stretching out beyond the academic environment?
Well, definitely it's stretching out. I mean, in our group, we also develop new products. We have several research-based prototypes at the moment. We built an educational companion. The idea is to have an app that accompanies a person from young age to the workforce and can provide support and responses and advice with respect to everything educational, which also includes social emotional learning skills. So yes, the short answer is we are also developing prototypes. However, it's at the moment in the structure of the company, it's not us who will bring those to market. It's the new product development team that is working on that. We also develop capabilities that we provide to other existing products. For example, we have a patent now on a new cognitive diagnostic model that accounts for the behavior analytics based on the data that we collect from the interactions of the student with the system. So this became in itself a capability that can be used by other existing products in the company. For example, cognitive diagnostic model for the ACT test or for the WorkKeys test or Aspire and so on.
So roughly, the mark of excellence of your work is some relatively objective measure that says you've hit an assessment target correctly. Is that
Or a learning state. Yeah.
So Josh, tell me about Koru.
Yeah, so I think our story kind of illustrates your Venn diagram in that we start from the business problem first and then work backwards. So the core business problem we work on is that hiring is fundamentally broken, which is that it's sort of the definition of insanity. We do the same thing over and over and expect different results. Right? Think of campus hiring, for example. We go to the same 12 schools. We fight with our competitors over the bottom third of candidates in those classes. We screen out 80% of people because they didn't go to the right school with the right GPA, the right major, didn't work at Google, Facebook, or Amazon before. And then we are surprised when we have turnover, and we have performance issues, and we have diversity issues. So we really took that as a problem both of access to opportunity from the candidate side and a business problem with real ROI and financial incentive to solving. And as we looked at how to solve that, and we talked to employers and hiring managers and said, okay, tell me about the best hires you've made. What were the attributes? How did you know? What experience did they have? Where did they studied? It kept coming back to, it wasn't about any of that. It was, do they have the grit and the work ethic? Do they have the teamwork skills? Can they think on their feet? Are they intellectually curious? Are they accountable? Do they follow through? If they have that stuff, we'll teach them the technical skills. If they have that stuff, I don't care where they went to school. We use all these things for proxies that increasingly people are figuring out aren't predictive. So Google did a big research study. They determined that GPA was worthless as a hiring criteria. So using that information, we really went back and said, okay, how do we start to look at biodata, which is a fancy word for stuff about people, meaning what classes did you take? What leadership positions did you hold? What prior work did you have? That gives you some predictive power. But there's a piece that was missing, those humanistic traits. We call them impact skills. And there's 7 that we focus on: grit, rigor, impact, teamwork, curiosity, ownership, and polish. And we said that's what hiring managers want to measure. Can they be measured? So then we went back to the research, 85 different research studies, other people validating work in terms of sub-competencies that roll up into what those hiring managers were saying. Leveraging, I spent 7 years at the Gates Foundation before co-founding Koru. So I spent a lot of Bill and Melinda's money and a lot of my time trying to answer these questions of what are the things that could predict success beyond GPA and where you went to school, et cetera. So we mined the best of that research and married it up through a 20-minute online instrument that is one of the inputs into a machine learning-driven predictive hiring model.
So what's excellence
May
in
I just say
Sure.
one thing? Because you mentioned the Google study, and you and I have talked
this is
about
great.
that on the phone. So at the end, when you talk, and I think it's fascinating what Koru does, and now at the end you said you are looking at all these skills that are necessary in addition to the GPA. And I want to emphasize the in addition to. And here is why. The Google study, unfortunately, is flawed psychometrically. And the problem is the following. The people that they interviewed, for which they checked their teamwork skills, their creativity, and so on, were already very high on their STEM qualities. So psychometrically speaking, it's called the ceiling effect. So there was no variation in that particular variable that was reflective of the technical skill. So when you do a traditional validity study, if people have not had the exposure to psychometric analysis, they might tend to see no evidence that that particular variable is relevant. But the truth is, that's the most important variable, and only after that you have the variance in the other variables. So actually, I did comment on that, and I recommended Google to hire a few psychometricians, because it's a problem, because people will consider, oh, it comes from Google, so it must be correct. So I would encourage, this happened, I worked with a group from ETH Zurich, which is a university in Zurich that is is an elite university, and they've been using TOEFL and GRE to screen for their graduate students. And it turned out that the GRE math didn't show up to be relevant at all. But once we started looking at it, it was because everyone had an almost perfect score on the GRE math. So if everyone scores very highly or very lowly, or wherever, if the variance is very low on a particular variable, then that variable won't appear as a valid and predictive tool. And that's that's where you need psychometricians to help look at conditional distribution and conditional predictive value. So we found out that everyone had a great math score. Therefore, we had to look at other variables that would distinguish them. And TOEFL scores in that case were extremely relevant. But if you only chose by TOEFL score because that was the variable that showed the highest predictive value, then they wouldn't have been able to do the programming for which they were brought into school. So personally, I'm very concerned, and this is about the title that we have here with not all glitter is gold. That's a good example for that.
Yeah,
and it's Google.
I think it's a great point, and I think that we trust data as the truth, despite imperfections in the quality of the data, the selection bias, the survivorship bias, and we have to be very careful at drawing absolutisms and making these large leaps of inference. However, one of the things we like to say is grit over grades. And what that is reminding people is that relying on singular variables, particularly ones that carry a significant amount of bias, is a bad way to do hiring, right? So if you were to select people only on whether they went to an exclusive school, right, it actually would be illegal in the United States to use that as a single hiring variable, because that carries disparate impact against protected classes, right? That's just, that's a mathematical, I mean, it's just a fact. So what it reminds people is, how do we think more holistically about candidates and holistically about how we hire? So we say grit over grades, people, I love that, and had breakfast with Angela Duckworth this week, and she was like, remember, Josh, grit and grades are correlated, right? Not surprisingly. I say yes, but what we're saying is reminding people to look more broadly. And then we build predictive models that are context specific. And that gets to the point of these broad assumptions. They're really dangerous when we make generalizations from one data set to another, one context to another. But we build local models on that set. And I can tell you that grit is not always predictive. And in some cases, grit is negatively predictive. You can have too much grit. You can be too narrowly focused. You can be not accepting of other people's opinions. You can be not willing to be flexible. And grades sometimes are predictive. And then we work with our clients and say, do you want grades to be, do you want college, US News College Report ranking is predictive here. Do you want that to be included in your model going forward? Do you want to give Harvard kids credit and advantage? Or do you want to take that out of the model and just use these other variables? So I think it's an art and a science. Yeah. And it's not for the faint of heart.
I agree.
So as I listen to you talk, I think I hear part of something that every startup is going to face, that every practitioner is going to face here, and that is there's a theoretical purity that you can attain, and there's a practical application. And anytime you go for the practical application, you commit sins of theoretical purity. And anytime you stick in the world of theoretical purity, you end up with a whole lot of people who don't understand what the hell you're talking about. And so as you take your work out into the world, both of you, how do you deal with that when you see it? Because there are vastly more people who don't understand what you're talking about than do.
Right. Well, I think it's also what's the bar? What do you consider the quality success? I think that Alina and I, probably because I love everything Alina's doing and I'm a big supporter of it, but I'm going to be provocative because why are we here at 4 o'clock on Wednesday?
Exactly,
We're not
we
going
should.
to throw a few rocks here. But I would say I think our bars are very different, right? My bar is, can I help influence a hiring process so that it creates economic value for the organization, a better economic opportunity for the candidate, and is less biased than the process that's being used today. And anything that moves in that step in the right direction is a good. And if an imperfect process gets people saying, you're right, we're all hiring with our gut, this is ridiculous. I hire athletes, you hire people who were head of the marketing club. And we can get away from that and start using data and start holding data back up to us and start moving the needle slightly better than it was yesterday. That's my threshold to get over. It's probably different than Alina's.
Well, I mean, communicating about what we do is definitely challenging with some groups of people and straightforward with others, as always. So I'm trying to, to communicate with those that understand the way we talk directly, and then work with communication experts to help translate some of our technical verbiage into something that is digestible for the other people. In terms of standards, I mean, actually my dream is to create capabilities that will help people like you, like Koru, the companies like Koru's and many others here, to, without the need of getting into all these details, but to be able to use these capabilities for more accurate predictions. As our CEO also said today, one of the things we work on, and that again differentiates us because we are a larger not-for-profit company, we want to be very transparent. So what we do, we publish our methodologies. We don't propose black boxes. We don't tell you, well, just trust me because I'm Alina. What we are trying to do is to write papers that are peer-reviewed and that are published out there. And once we come to any of you with a recommendation and a capability, we can say, well, check our algorithm. They are out there. And you can form yourself an opinion about. We also try to be very careful at building interfaces. So we work with UX designers so that even if the algorithm is really complex, the user doesn't need to know the derivatives up to second order in order to use that kind of capability. So we want to make it as self-contained as possible. Our dream is actually to become part of other people's solutions because we realize that what we do is, I don't know, what else can I compare with? Take your phone, for example, and have Siri. It's the same thing. You build the algorithm for Siri to speak with you, but you don't need to know the mathematics behind that algorithm. So it's exactly for us. We want to create those algorithms and give it to companies like yours. And work with every one of you.
We'll be your first beta testers.
Wonderful, let's talk.
Yeah, let's do it. And I would say too, on your point on the UX design, I know John, this is an area you have a lot of passion around too. I think we learned very early that that a black box doesn't help a process where humans are engaged. So if we could outsource the decision 100%, a black box is fine. Let's run it, see whose black box is better, and at the end of the day, we pick the one that performs better. But these are human processes, and in most things that apply machine learning, AI, it's going to be the human plus the machine that beats the machine alone or the human alone. And so that means it's a human computer interface challenge. And so we'll even ship less predictive models because they're easier to understand. So just saying Josh is an 82 is not helpful. I need to be able to unpack the black box and say, because, remember when we did the research, 6 variables were most important, and Josh is hitting 4 of those 6 and has potential weaknesses on the remaining 2, and then continue to follow that down on those weaknesses. Here's how to probe those in an interview, kind of close the loop and meet that decision maker where they are. What we like to say is that our goal is to help make these people better deciders, not to ever make a decision for them. And that's a high bar when you have a distributed process moving very quickly. A recruiting team is more like a factory floor than a job shop. And so it's a big design challenge.
Yeah, absolutely.
And like you said, the data is gonna drift further and further to the background. When you log into Netflix to get your recommendation feed, you don't see any, here's Jumanji. It's got a 82.7532 fit with you. It says, hey, because your kid watched something else, we recommend Jumanji.
Yeah.
So assessment has almost universal acceptance in the education market. In industry, it's hovers somewhere around 40 or 50%, and the rest of the people who don't use assessment think that it's voodoo. What do you suppose explains the difference between the two worlds?
Why don't you start on that?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I think one is there's legal ramifications. We have a set of employment laws that are very clear about protecting employment rights, and they're actually stiffer on the front end in many ways than firing on the back end. And so in places like the EU and Australia, other places where it's much more difficult to get rid of employees that aren't a good fit, and lower bar in terms of the protections on the front end, you see a lot more assessment adoption. Because the cost of a bad hire, you're stuck with it. I think that's one. I think the candidate experience is another one, particularly as we get much more in passive candidates and LinkedIn. I'm reaching out to you, and everybody's kind of constantly in this search, or 80% of employees are, open and available. The idea of throwing up an old school assessment that makes you feel like you're back in high school with a bubble chart and a number 2 pencil is pretty off-putting. So you really need to create a win-win experience. And then I think there's this sense of, I know what I need, right? It's the hippo versus the geek. I'm the expert. I'm the hiring expert for my team. And so, yeah, we should reduce bias. We have this all the time. Hey, I'm really glad we're working on this project. It'll help reduce bias. Yeah, all those hiring managers, they're biased. You should definitely work with them, right? They need to, figure it out. I'm like, oh, not me, right? So anything where you're implicitly telling somebody they're not good at their job, there's resistance.
Yeah, and I agree with everything you said. I just want to point out a few examples where the assessment is actually used and you wouldn't want it any other way. So think about the case that just happened yesterday. The pilot who brought the plane in, under those circumstances, she saved the life of those people that were left there. So in order for her to become a pilot, she had to be tested. And you wouldn't want it any other way. You would want your pilots to be tested, and you want to feel comfortable that they passed. Similarly, you want your medical doctors to be tested, and they are a lot. Not only that they are tested once they start, but they are tested regularly. I don't know, every 5 years, every 8 years. Again, you would not want it any other way. When you go out to choose your doctor, you would rather want to know that those doctors have been certified. Similarly, with the military, if you go into the military, you need to pass a test. It's actually one of the oldest tests we have in the country. Is the ASVAB, the military entrance test. And I can come up with other examples, but I guess I already communicated that there are jobs that have a really high level of scrutiny, and that, of course, the legal requirements are attached to that. But not only the legal one, it's just the professional level that they require is so high, and it needs so much precision that you do expect them to be tested, and you want people to be certified.
So
Why do you think, John?
Well,
you observe this space a lot too. What else did we miss on that list?
So there's a couple of things. You have adequately accounted for the 50% adoption rate, right? In places where the lawyers will get you when the plane falls out of the sky if the welder isn't certified properly. That's all very well done. When you're talking about people in non-life-threatening, non-safety situations, the process of installing assessment means that the organization has to make a mindset change, and it has to adopt a way of thinking about people and a language associated with that way of thinking about people. And that is an extraordinarily difficult organizational transformation to make happen. It is, by leaps and bounds, the biggest failure point in the expansion of assessment as a tool, because assessment isn't just a test. Assessment is a framework. It's a way of talking about things. It's a way of thinking about things. And if you and I agree on this, and Josh doesn't understand what we're talking about, the assessment isn't adopted, because Josh isn't going to perpetuate, right? If you say that grit is the thing in our organization, and you don't evolve processes to cultivate and reward and incent that, and really make the assessment system stick, it doesn't. It doesn't, and so it melts off the edges, and it can be perfectly wonderful science, but perfectly wonderful science that isn't designed to be held by an organization with its organizational processes simply fails every single time. So.
Yeah. I think it's a good point. There are jobs for which probably the interview does not quite qualify as an assessment. It probably also depends on the type of job. Even for a company like ours, if you hire a scientist, for example, I mean, sure, you don't put that person to a test with multiple choice, but you do expect that person to give a presentation, and that presentation is being rated. So it is, in a way, a performance assessment, if you want, at least at the research level. So for other jobs, probably where you don't have a lot of risk, you can be content with recommendations and resumes. But it depends on how, I still believe that it depends on how much responsibility will be on that person, and what type of legal consequences will be.
So I think many of the people who are in this room doing startups are concerned about organizational fit, right? And organizational fit sort of transcends those arguments, and it's the assertion that you can somehow, without perpetuating discriminatory biases, figure out what makes somebody stick in an organization versus what doesn't stick inside of an organization. And so it's less of a, I think that's the heart of what you're doing, isn't it, Josh? Is trying to make sense about whether or not I'm going to get fired 2 weeks into the job because I don't belong there.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think that you're right to hit on both those issues. One being that culture fit has been a shield for this person's not like me,
Right.
and hurting our diversity, inclusion, and belonging work. And so I think that we try and tie these things not as abstract constructs of how people are and are they like me, but instead do they demonstrate the behaviors that are required to succeed in the job. So while teamwork is, we like people who play nice with others. It's like, well, what is like the specific action, the observable behavior that this person will have done in a previous job that they will report being good at? Right? Do they resolve conflict on a team? Do they draw others out into a conversation? Are they the person that gets asked to present findings? Right? Those are tied to the job itself. And I think if you hear people talk about cultural fit things and you can't map them to bullet points on the job description, you're at this abstract level, which is at risk of staying up on the big letters on the wall, or letting itself go down into a culture fit place. We actually hear people talking more about values fit,
Yeah.
which is a different way
Yeah.
to try and get beyond this black box of culture fit.
Yeah, and in hiring scientists, I'm definitely more focused on value fit, and then by any means cultural fit, defined in a different way. I was wondering, what do you think about transfer? Because in my job as a manager of sorts of and leader of researchers, at really high-end researchers, I was often in the position of hiring people from a different discipline and bringing them into education, and brilliant people. And with many of them, after many, many conversations, I still had the impression that they couldn't make the transfer for, even in terms of statistics, talking about the data and the models instead of talking with the application in, say, meteorology, but then talking about the application into the learning process. So many people don't seem to be able to make that jump. I was wondering, does Koru look at transfer, or do you have other variables that would get to transfer?
Well, I think we would want to see that show up in some of the variables that are correlated with success. And so what I mean, the data would tell us there's really three things that predicts someone's success on a job. Correct me if I'm wrong, because you probably know this literature much better than I do. But one is cognitive ability, right? There's good connection, at least to a point, and for a lot of jobs. Two is technical skills. So you do have the hard skills, the stats or whatever. And then third is the all else bucket, right? We call those impact skills, soft skills, personality, whatever those things are. And so the question would be, if somebody's not making that transfer, what is it? Was it a horsepower issue? Was it the stats? Or in those other areas, so we're looking for proxies. Right? All assessment is really trying to proxy. So it's how close can you get to direct assessment is still a close proxy as opposed to a far proxy. And so if people have been successful there in the past, have all worked in education before, right, or having worked in education increases the probability of them being a fit here, we should see that come through in the bio data, which is one of the things we haven't talked much about is this, let the machine find the correlation without any research-based explanatory power. And I think we try and combine both of those because to try and take advantage of the big data sets, but not just say that left-handed people that post on Facebook on Tuesday nights are better researchers, so therefore that's the profile. So I think that would be one way that we would circulate.
So do either of you work with a variable that is sort of the capacity to drop one frame of reference in favor of the next frame of reference? One of the things I know in this transfer process is that all organizations have a point of view, and they may harness the same technical skills and they may harness the same softer skills, but that point of view may have customers first, it may have employees first, it may have the value of cost savings first, but there's a whole range of things inside of the new environment that are different from the old environment, and that's where you get the hiccup. You get people who can't make the shift for maybe genetic reasons and maybe circumstance, or maybe the last firing was too brutal. You don't really know. Do you have variables that address that ability to move
change
between
So
systems?
the two that I think that are relevant here in the literature, one is openness to change. So that is that willingness to listen to different points of view, being okay, who moved my cheese, that's not going to totally derail you. And then the other is quick learner. And if you have those two attributes, that idea of kind of learning agility, the willingness to take on a new challenge, to have your preconceived notions challenged and change them, and then quickly adapt. So I was on a panel with a woman from Cisco a couple months ago, and she said learning agility is the new smart. It's not about horsepower, it's how quickly you can take in these new things. So those are two, at least, that we look at that are connected to that.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely is a challenge for many companies. Everyone is talking about change, and we are changing all types of things around us. And we expect the employees to notice, to actually hear it, that there is a required change in the way they work and in the skills that they need to build. There is an expectation that people will do that quickly. And I believe it's hard for some. I haven't quite figured out why. I mean, I really don't think, maybe it's a different construct. It's not pure ability. Maybe this agility of learning that stands out as a separate construct. In my case, I was actually talking about something that's even more difficult. I was looking for people who came from other disciplines such as physics, particularly those who study physics, have been exposed to modeling very complex, large data sets and working with dynamic models and working within this chaos theory, so where you develop a model that may change its state and might never converge to an equilibrium state. And that type of thinking and modeling was important, is still important, I believe, for what we are trying to do with learning, because the learning process sometimes is completely unsuccessful, and we need to figure out what external factors come and interrupt and destabilize that process. So I've been looking for people with PhDs in physics to come and work with me in education to start modeling this type of problems. And many of them had difficulties making the transfer between the data that they were using for physical experiments or from astronomy into the data that would come out from education as text, for example, from essays, or as states in an intelligent tutoring system. But as a mathematician, if you stand back and you just write it as random variables, it shouldn't be such a big deal, I thought. Well, I was wrong. So for many people, that was a problem. So it turned out that in order to hire, I ended up hiring really, really brilliant, very good people. But I spent, as a hiring manager, I spent a lot of time in pre-hiring screening that were pretty much working on the board with them. And it was nothing that if you would read in any book about how you hire at this level, you can't ever find that you will actually be working with them on the board, like in school. But that's what we ended up doing. And it turned out that the number of hours I put for hiring at that level was an incredible amount of time. So I would love to hear more from companies like yours that would help me at hiring at that level. I don't think it's something we can make automatic at this point. I think it's one of those places where artificial intelligence and human intelligence, the artificial one can't quite compete with what a human brings to the table. But that would be something I would really love to see from Koru, that at high end, helping the hiring manager hiring at the high end expertise.
I'll put it on the product roadmap.
Please.
So let's do a last one. One of the things that concerns me about the way that machines are starting to control standards for hiring, and I'm going to include this in that broad category of standards for hiring, is it eliminates the kind of serendipity that actually makes organizations work, right? And so if you say, here's this profile and you got to hit this profile, what you do is you establish a bar that eliminates in practice the possibility of somebody who doesn't fit the criteria coming in and excelling, right? And that is maybe a primary source of innovation in organizations. It's certainly a primary source of learning inside of innovations. And so how do you prevent good assessment testing from becoming a kind of a lid beyond which you can't take anything?
Yeah, I think that there's really good research on positive deviance, right? That they are deviant from the way the operating system in the organization, but for good, right? It's like the Robin Hood, in the company. So it's something we think about. We get questions a lot on that. And I don't have a perfect answer, but I'll tell you a few things that we've done there. One is there's more than one way to get a high fit score, right? That there's not a singular, you fit this, you get a good score. It's that, as I said, there may be 6, there may be 8, there may be 10, 12 variables. And very few people are actually hitting the bid on all 12 of those. So that there's multiple ways to be an 80. 2 is we've actually built something into our candidate profiles. This is, why is this person unique? And so it actually calls out things that are rare among the data set. Hey, this person is a triple major, and here's what those 3 majors are. Hey, this person's been 99th percentile in communication polish. I mean, anyone who's ever taken this test. So we try and flag that as a way to catch the attention. Like, wait a second, I'm going to put them on this team where the whole thing is they're going to stand up and present the findings, and if they can't be believed and authentic, that no one's going to take them. So I think that's, I think the other thing is, we also say, look, the assessment needs to be guardrailed in terms of how much of the decision it's taking on. Sometimes people have said, you should never use an assessment for more than a third of the data in your decision making. But it's true. You give people a tool, and you have to be careful how they're gonna wield it.
Right.
I absolutely concur with everything that you said.
Come on, fight on something.
Not on this one. We'll find other
right.
things to fight on.
Let me give you another one, which is we're in this,
He wants
we're in
us
this
to fight.
tsunami of data, and we are learning every day that what we knew yesterday was wrong, that we're cooking assumptions that don't make any sense. And so what do you think the odds are that there's going to be a variable that pops out of the data, out of the big data flow that upsets your entire apple cart?
I
How
think
likely
it's
do you
very
think
likely.
that is?
I think it's quite likely, especially now with the help of technology. If we are indeed able to observe people in action, I think we are going to learn much more about them. I mean, sure, the privacy and the legal aspect might intervene and control a bit what we could do, but definitely I think there is a good probability that we will discover a new features. I mean, even this transfer that we've been talking about, I still hope that we could be able to find what would be a good proxy for transfer. What is a good proxy for creative thinking? And I really like what you said about the positive deviance, because this is one of the scoring for creativity. So if one of the standard tasks for creative thinking is you will ask people to come up with a number of solutions for using, say, one boring object, a brick is very common. And then you would look to see what people came up with, and the ones that have this positive deviance, so that hasn't showed up many times and it's out there by itself, that is often considered, as gets a higher weight for scoring creative thinking. So maybe transfer is part of creative thinking. So I am sure that we will have responses to some of these questions in the next years with the technology that we have.
So I think the other thing is that there's a lot of inputs and a lot of outcomes. And what that means is it creates multiple sources of truth. And that's really confusing and destabilizing. So I don't know if you read the article a couple weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago now, where somebody sent their DNA to 23andMe, and they sent it to like all the 5 major ones, and they got back like, you're 25% Native American, and the other was like, you're 25, and so the results were totally different. And so as long as you only ask one of those, you feel confident. But as soon as you send your DNA to 2 places, you feel like you have no idea. And so it's the same kind of thing. You look at the data and say, great, well, what are the predictors of retention? Oh, that's the source truth. Great, what are the predictors of hitting quota on a sales team? Oh, wait, those are different. And then the next cohort next year, you say, well, what predicts quota next year? You're like, oh, well, that's different too. So I think one of the things is we've been playing with is how do you smooth the data? How do you create a rolling average? So think about like stock price, like it changes a lot, and that sort of destabilizes. But like, what's the trend? And so rather than, just how do you add the data in and look at it in frequent enough standpoints so that you see the evolution, so that you don't have these giant shocks where you say, yeah, we added in 100 more records and things are starting to emerge, and 1,000 more records, and so you don't sort of close your eyes for 3 years, and then a whole bunch of things emerge, and then you realize you screwed yourself for the last 2.5 years.
So thanks. I'm going to take my poetic license here and try to summarize a little bit. The thing that makes me happiest about this conversation is we talked about assessment in the workplace for an hour, and nobody claimed to eliminate bias. And that makes me happier than you could ever know, because that is a singularly nonsensical thing that's been percolating around the environment. You cannot do that.
But you can reduce it.
Huh?
You can reduce it.
You can mitigate it, you can reduce it, you can do all sorts of things, but human beings without bias are not interesting.
Our tables.
They're tables, they're exactly furniture. So I want to thank you for taking the time to do this. If you would join me in. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was
John.
wonderful. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you for
All right,
moderating.
and thanks for coming in. If you are in the business, if you would give me your card, that would be phenomenal, and we will get you into the report.
And if you have any questions, feel free to, I'm sure it's true for Josh, send us an email if you want to know more about the type of work we do.